I remember the first time I saw him in a dress, and it's strange how that memory presses itself into my mind like something sacred, something I almost hesitate to touch with words. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't a joke, though part of me had expected something silly, a fleeting experiment. But the moment was heavy, weighted with unspoken questions and quiet tension. He stood in front of the mirror, twisting his fingers together, chewing on the inside of his cheek like he was trying to negotiate with himself. I could see him noticing me noticing him, and there was that flash of nervousness, that unguarded vulnerability that makes you want to protect someone without even thinking about it. There was curiosity in his eyes, too, a curiosity tempered with fear, the sort of fear that isn't about being laughed at but about seeing yourself differently than you ever had before. I felt a pull in that instant, not of desire, not of spectacle, but a pull toward empathy and understanding. Something inside me whispered that I could help him explore what it meant to inhabit another version of himself, to let the part of him that had always been quiet and tucked away breathe. "Do you want me to help you try more?" I asked quietly, almost afraid of my own words. He froze, his eyes darting to mine, searching for something, acceptance, judgment, reassurance. Then he nodded and shook his head at the same time, a contradictory motion that felt profoundly human. I realized immediately that consent was complicated but real, and that stepping forward meant taking responsibility not only for him but for myself. Could I guide him without overstepping? Could I allow him to explore himself while keeping him safe from ridicule, from the harshness of the world outside? The weight of that responsibility pressed down on me, and for a moment, I questioned my own ability to handle it. Our first session was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its quietness. We began with small, safe experiments, clothes he already had tucked away in a drawer, simple accessories, scarves, and jewelry that could transform without overwhelming. I watched him as he tried on a soft blouse, fumbling with the buttons, glancing at the mirror, glancing at me. The reflection staring back at him was strange and new, yet familiar in ways that weren't immediately clear. I realized that transformation wasn't about looking like someone else, it was about recognition, about discovering what had always been there beneath layers of habit, expectation, and self-consciousness. And I, unexpectedly, was a witness, a participant, a quiet collaborator. We spent hours talking, softly, about fear and shame, about how society had conditioned him to hide parts of himself, about the anxiety that accompanied stepping into another version of one's own identity. He spoke hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness, about how liberating yet terrifying it felt to experiment with how he presented himself. I began to understand that this wasn't a superficial exercise, it was a form of self-exploration, a meditation on identity and courage. Every small choice, a necklace, a tucked-in shirt, the way he held his hands, was a conversation with himself about who he was allowed to be, and who he might be if he dared. When we decided to take a short walk outside, the world transformed into something far sharper, far more immediate than either of us expected. Even under a neutral gray sky, the streets seemed more pointed, more observant, more judgmental than the quiet safety of our apartment. His pace faltered, his shoulders stiffened, and I felt my own heartbeat spike with a combination of pride, fear, and guilt. Pride, because he had trusted me to share this vulnerable part of himself. Fear, because the world is not always kind to those who step outside prescribed boxes. Guilt, because I had introduced him to this path and now carried the weight of its risks. I tried to remain a steady presence beside him, speaking softly, offering gentle encouragement without imposing expectations. My role was not to lead, but to accompany, to be a mirror reflecting his courage back to him. By the time we returned home, exhausted in a way that only true vulnerability can produce, we were quieter than usual, aware of the small magnitude of what we had just attempted. He carefully removed each item, folding it with a care that felt almost reverential, and looked at me with a soft, almost shy gratitude. He thanked me, not just for helping him with clothes, but for seeing him, for allowing him to exist in a form that felt wholly his own. And in that moment, I realized I had learned something essential. Transformation isn't about changing someone, it's about creating the space for them to fully become themselves, and in doing so, discovering new parts of your own humanity. As I lay awake that night, replaying each hesitant step, each quiet conversation, each fleeting glance toward the mirror, I understood the depth of what we were doing. I thought about how harshly we judge ourselves, how rarely we offer patience and understanding, how transformative empathy can be when wielded carefully. I thought about responsibility, about how the smallest gestures of care and trust ripple outward, affecting self-perception, relationships, and the way we navigate the world. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the journey ahead would be messy, challenging, and profoundly human. But I also knew that whatever lay ahead, it was worth it, that to witness him, to guide him, to be present in his exploration of self, was one of the most important and quietly transformative experiences I would ever have. The days after our first evening were quiet in their own way, but inside me, everything was anything but quiet. I found myself replaying every gesture, every expression, every nervous laugh. There was a complexity to what we had begun that I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about him experimenting with appearance, it was about both of us navigating a labyrinth of trust, identity, and moral responsibility. I noticed small things I had ignored before, the way he would glance at his reflection even when dressed normally, the way his posture changed when he thought no one was watching, the way he seemed to measure his words when speaking about himself. Each of these subtle shifts was a quiet signal, a breadcrumb trail into the deeper corners of his psyche, and I realized that helping him was as much about listening as it was about any visible transformation. We started planning our next session with cautious enthusiasm. This time, it wasn't just clothes, it was mannerisms, tone of voice, the way he moved through space. He practiced walking slowly, deliberately, trying to find a rhythm that felt comfortable rather than performative. I watched, offering suggestions only when he asked, reminding myself constantly that my role was facilitative, not directive. One evening, as he tried to mirror a gesture he'd noticed in someone on television, he laughed and admitted that it felt absurd. But there was also a sparkle in his eyes, a tiny recognition of self that he hadn't articulated before. I realized in that moment that transformation, this kind of careful, thoughtful transformation, wasn't linear. It was uneven, fragile, full of false starts and sudden breakthroughs. And every misstep was just as important as every triumph, because it revealed layers of self that had never been fully seen, even by him. There were challenges I hadn't anticipated. Some mornings, he would refuse to try anything new, retreating into familiar clothes and familiar ways of moving through the world. I felt a twinge of frustration, not at him, but at the fragility of courage, at how easily doubt could creep into even the most determined mind. I had to remind myself constantly that this process couldn't be rushed, that empathy demanded patience, and that the smallest judgments or pressures could undo weeks of progress. I also had to confront my own emotions. I noticed a protective instinct that went beyond friendship, a desire to shield him from every potential slight or awkward glance. That instinct felt natural, but I wondered if it was truly helping him grow or if it was simply my way of avoiding discomfort. These reflections became almost a private dialogue I held with myself, separate from our sessions but equally essential to the integrity of the process. The outside world remained a source of tension. Even when he felt confident in our apartment, the thought of stepping into a cafe, a store, or just walking past neighbors carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. He would check his reflection in the window, smooth imaginary wrinkles from his shirt, adjust his hair. I noticed the way his eyes darted around, reading imagined judgments in the faces of strangers. And in those moments, I understood something profound: the psychological transformation was inseparable from social perception. The courage he cultivated internally had to confront the world externally, and that confrontation was both delicate and essential. We had conversations about it, long and winding discussions about fear, expectation, and authenticity. I tried to give words to feelings he couldn't fully articulate, while constantly checking that I wasn't overstepping or imposing interpretations of my own. One afternoon, we ventured further than before, into a small park near the river. He wore a light scarf, one of the first he had dared to try outside our apartment, and a simple jacket that softened the lines of his usual silhouette. I watched him as he walked ahead, hesitated at the entrance, then drew a slow, steadying breath. Something shifted in his expression, a fleeting relief that he could inhabit this self without immediate catastrophe. I realized then that every outing was a negotiation, not just between him and the world, but between his old self and the emerging self he was discovering. Each step outside was a lesson in trust, in patience, in holding space for someone else to navigate fear and hope simultaneously. And I, for my part, had to trust that my guidance could be helpful without being controlling, supportive without being overbearing. Our conversations grew deeper as the days passed. He spoke about shame, not as a distant concept but as a constant companion in his life. He spoke about the weight of societal expectations, about the ways he had learned to shrink himself to avoid ridicule or misunderstanding. I listened, sometimes silently, sometimes offering reflections, always aware that my role was to witness without rewriting his narrative. And I noticed changes in myself, too. I became more reflective, more conscious of the assumptions I carried, more aware of the subtle ways society molds behavior and identity. Helping him explore himself had become a mirror into my own values, biases, and emotional landscape. By the end of that week, we had reached a quiet understanding. Transformation wasn't about spectacle, about sudden outward changes or dramatic revelations. It was about the small, cumulative shifts, the softening of posture, the way he allowed himself to linger in front of a mirror without judgment, the subtle courage of wearing a scarf outside even when every part of him wanted to flee. And I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that the moral dimension of this process was as significant as the emotional or psychological. I had a responsibility to ensure that what we were doing honored his autonomy, preserved his dignity, and expanded his sense of self rather than constraining it. I had to acknowledge my own limitations, my own impulses to guide or control, and consciously set them aside in favor of careful accompaniment. That night, as we sat quietly with mugs of tea, he leaned back and said something simple but weighty. I feel like I can breathe a little differently. I understood exactly what he meant. Transformation isn't always dramatic or visible, often it is quiet, internal, and cumulative. It is measured in moments of ease, moments of recognition, and moments of trust. And I realized that in helping him inhabit this space safely, in holding a mirror for him to explore the contours of his identity, I had learned perhaps one of the most valuable lessons of all: empathy is not passive. It is active, deliberate, and morally demanding. It requires honesty with oneself, vigilance over one's own impulses, and the willingness to step into another's uncertainty without taking it over. We lingered in silence after that, not out of awkwardness but because the quiet carried a significance neither of us wanted to disrupt. I thought about how small acts of courage ripple outward, how trust can transform ordinary spaces into sites of revelation, how the simplest gestures, folding a scarf, straightening a sleeve, offering a steady hand, can carry ethical weight. And deep inside, I knew that this was only the beginning, that the path ahead would challenge both of us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. But I also knew that it was worth it. That every step, every conversation, every small act of courage was a testament not just to him, but to the human capacity for growth, understanding, and compassion. After a few weeks of these careful experiments, I began to notice subtle but profound changes in him and in myself. It wasn't just about clothing, or scarves, or the occasional brush of nail polish on a fingertip, it was about rhythm, posture, attention, and the quiet shaping of identity. He started to move differently, not because I told him to, but because he was learning to inhabit a body and a self in a way that felt authentic rather than imposed. I watched him from across the room, sipping my tea, noting the slight lift of his chin when he laughed, the slow deliberation in the way he arranged his hands on the table. It was fascinating, humbling, and occasionally terrifying to witness the interior life of another person unfolding with such fragile bravery. I had always thought of myself as empathetic, as a patient observer, but suddenly those traits felt like they were being tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. Our conversations deepened, spiraling into subjects I had never expected to navigate. He spoke about shame, how it clung to him like a second skin, how society's rules for masculinity had made him shrink, fold, and flatten himself into a version that was safe but incomplete. He admitted to fears I had only glimpsed before, fears of ridicule, fear of misunderstanding, even fear of rejection by friends and family. And yet, paradoxically, he also spoke of relief, of the subtle exhilaration that accompanied every small step into this self he had long kept hidden. Listening to him, I realized that the transformation was as much psychological as it was social or physical. The courage required was enormous, and I felt a deep responsibility not only to witness it but to nurture it with care, respect, and unwavering attention. One afternoon, we decided to try a more public experiment. Not a dramatic reveal, not an act meant to shock, but a small, deliberate test of boundaries, a short walk to a nearby cafe. I could see the tension in his shoulders as he approached the door. His scarf was loosely draped, his jacket familiar but chosen for comfort and confidence rather than appearance. He glanced at me, and our eyes met in silent communication, a mixture of reassurance, warning, and mutual acknowledgement that this was a space of risk. I realized that in those moments, I was not just a partner in the process, but a co-navigator of moral responsibility. Every glance from a passerby, every imagined judgment, every flicker of self-doubt was something we faced together. My presence was a buffer, but it could never eliminate the inherent vulnerability of stepping into a world that may not understand, that may even resist the authenticity we were striving to express. As we moved through the streets, I became acutely aware of my own internal responses. Protective instincts flared alongside empathy. I wanted to shield him from every potential slight, every sneer or glance that might pierce his confidence. But I also knew that overprotection could undermine growth. Transformation, I realized, required exposure to reality, even if reality was sometimes uncomfortable or unjust. I had to trust his resilience, his judgment, his courage, while providing steady support. And I found that balancing act to be profoundly enlightening. I was learning the ethics of empathy, the delicate art of being present without controlling, of supporting without directing, of witnessing without appropriating. Inside the cafe, the experiment continued in quieter, subtler ways. He ordered for himself, speaking carefully but with increasing comfort. He lingered over his coffee, watching the world outside the window, and I could see the way he measured his movements, adjusting, testing, discovering what felt natural. It was a fragile dance, a negotiation between internal and external selves. And as I observed him, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. Every suggestion I offered, every word of encouragement, every glance of reassurance carried weight. I was acutely aware of the potential for missteps, for moments in which my own desire to help might tip into influence or pressure. And yet, carefully, we navigated it together, learning a rhythm that honored both autonomy and support. Later that evening, as we returned home, I noticed the quiet pride etched into his posture. He folded his scarf, carefully hung his jacket, and sat down with a reflective look that seemed older, deeper than before. We spoke softly about the experience, about fear and triumph, about the tiny victories that often go unnoticed but are crucial in building confidence and self-recognition. I realized that transformation was cumulative, almost imperceptible in its daily movements, yet immense in its eventual impact. The courage to inhabit an authentic self, even in small increments, demanded moral and emotional integrity, not just from him, but from me. I had to reflect constantly on my own motives, to question whether my guidance was ethical, supportive, and unobtrusive. Over time, I noticed something extraordinary. The process was changing me as well. I had always thought of empathy as a passive state, an ability to imagine what another person feels. But here, empathy was active. It required vigilance, patience, and an almost constant moral accounting. I became more conscious of my own assumptions, more aware of the ways society shapes behavior and identity, and more humble in my understanding of courage. Observing him navigate vulnerability, I realized that personal transformation can be a mirror, reflecting the capacities, limitations, and biases of those who bear witness. And I was beginning to understand the quiet, profound truth that supporting someone in discovering their authentic self is as much a moral and ethical endeavor as it is an emotional one. That night, as we sat in silence, I reflected on the days that had passed. I realized that transformation is not linear, not glamorous, not always visible. It is subtle, incremental, and deeply internal. The small victories, a comfortable glance in the mirror, a measured step into public space, a gesture of self-expression, carry weight beyond the immediate moment. And I understood, with a clarity that left me both awed and humbled, that the journey ahead would challenge both of us in ways that are unpredictable and profound. But I also knew, with certainty, that the effort, the care, the responsibility, and the trust were worth it. In helping him discover himself, in being present for his courage, I had discovered something equally transformative about myself, that true empathy is active, deliberate, and morally demanding, and that growth, both personal and relational, is measured not in spectacle but in the integrity of our attention, the patience of our guidance, and the depth of our understanding. It was a week later when we decided to take the next step, not in a rush but as a deliberate experiment in vulnerability and trust. Up to this point, our explorations had been largely private, confined to the safety of the apartment, or in brief forays into semi-public spaces where risk felt manageable. But I could see him beginning to crave something more, something that would test his newfound confidence, a chance to see how the world would respond to him beyond the bubble we had carefully constructed. And I, perhaps naively, thought I was ready to guide him, to be the steady presence beside him as he ventured into that uncertain terrain. I wasn't prepared, though, for the complex web of emotions that would accompany this step. We chose a small bookstore downtown, a place I had always loved, quiet, with soft lighting and corners that invited lingering. Even so, the moment we stepped onto the street, the familiar adrenaline returned. He walked ahead of me, scarf loosely draped, jacket buttoned just enough to soften the lines of his shoulders. His steps were measured, cautious, yet I could see the subtle spring of excitement in his movement. Every glance he gave to the reflections in the windows, every small adjustment of clothing or hair, was an act of negotiation with the world outside and with the self he was learning to inhabit. I felt my own heart tighten, not from fear for him alone, but from the awareness of the stakes, the moral responsibility I bore in facilitating this exploration. Inside the bookstore, the tension didn't dissipate. I watched him run his fingers along the spines of books, lingering over titles he might have ignored before. He seemed hyper-aware of every passerby, every glance that might carry judgment, every whisper of societal expectation. And yet, paradoxically, there was also a quiet freedom in his movement, a soft courage that I had never witnessed before. It was mesmerizing to see him exist fully in this space, a blend of apprehension and exhilaration, self-consciousness and emerging confidence. I realized that transformation wasn't just about appearance, it was about negotiating the internal and external worlds simultaneously, a dance between who we are and who we dare to become. As we approached the cashier, I noticed his hands trembling slightly. Not from fear alone, but from the enormity of inhabiting a self that had previously been relegated to private, safe spaces. He smiled politely, paid for a book he had lingered over, and for the first time, I sensed him claiming agency in a way that was quiet but powerful. And I knew, in that moment, that my role had shifted. It was no longer merely about support or guidance, it was about respect, trust, and ethical vigilance. I had to balance the natural desire to protect him with the need to allow exposure to reality, to let him navigate his own courage and judgment. The moral dimension of this journey became increasingly apparent that evening when he spoke of friends we had invited over later. "Do you think they'll understand?" he asked, voice tentative, searching. I had anticipated this question but not the depth of anxiety it carried. It wasn't about ridicule alone, it was about acceptance, about the invisible barometer of social validation, about the fear that something private, something deeply personal, might be misread or trivialized. I had to think carefully about my response. I reminded him that true friends respect honesty and that trust is measured not by conformity but by willingness to accept vulnerability. And yet, even as I said this, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against us, the fragile tension of exposing a private self to public observation, even in a circle of people we considered safe. When our friends arrived, I could see him shrink slightly, posture stiffening, hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. I tried to remain a calm presence, offering subtle nods, soft words of encouragement. The conversations flowed around us, sometimes drifting close to the edges of discomfort. I noticed his attention flickering, sometimes anxious, sometimes curious, sometimes assertive as he navigated social norms in a new guise. And I realized that public exposure wasn't just a social exercise, it was a test of emotional resilience, an education in boundaries, empathy, and self-recognition. I found myself reflecting constantly on the ethics of my guidance. When does encouragement become pressure? When does support cross into influence? And how could I ensure that every action preserved dignity, autonomy, and trust? After they left, we sat quietly for a long time. He spoke softly, almost whispering, about how strange it had felt to be observed, even by friends who cared for him. "I didn't think I could do it," he admitted. "But I feel lighter somehow." I understood exactly what he meant. Transformation isn't always visible, it isn't always dramatic. It's measured in subtle shifts, an eased posture, a confident glance, a hesitation turned into self-assurance. And in that quiet exchange, I realized that the moral and emotional responsibilities of guiding someone through such a transformation are ongoing, almost infinite. Every gesture, every word, every supportive glance carries consequences that shape both internal and external reality. The following days were reflective and, at times, exhausting. We spent hours discussing identity, morality, and social perception. He explored, tentatively, the idea that femininity isn't a costume, but a lens, a set of behaviors and choices that can coexist with a self that is already complex and complete. I realized that the process wasn't about teaching him to be someone else, it was about helping him articulate and inhabit the parts of himself that society had pressured him to suppress. And in turn, I confronted my own biases, my assumptions, my limitations. I had thought I understood empathy, I had thought I knew patience. But this process revealed that supporting another person's journey toward authenticity is active, morally charged, and emotionally rigorous in ways I had never fully appreciated. One afternoon, as he lingered by the window, watching passers-by, he remarked quietly, "It's weird. I feel like I can exist in this way, and still be me. Not pretending, not performing, just me." And I felt a deep surge of both humility and awe. The transformation was not in the fabric of clothing, nor in the scarf, nor in the careful gestures, it was in self-recognition, in claiming agency over one's own identity. And I realized, profoundly, that my role was not to teach him this, but to witness it, to reflect it back, to honor it with care and responsibility. In helping him inhabit that space safely, I had also discovered new dimensions of my own humanity, the responsibility of empathy, the challenge of moral guidance, and the delicate, transformative power of trust. By the end of Part 4, I knew with certainty that the journey ahead would demand even more patience, courage, and self-awareness from both of us. Transformation was not linear, nor guaranteed, nor comfortable. But the lessons we were learning, the moral clarity of support, the ethics of guidance, the subtle power of authentic self-expression, were as profound as any I had encountered. And deep inside, I understood that in nurturing his emergence, I was also nurturing my own capacity for empathy, reflection, and human understanding in ways that would shape me forever. The days that followed our careful public experiments felt charged with a kind of quiet tension I hadn't fully anticipated. Up until this point, our explorations had been contained, deliberate, almost ritualistic, carefully measured sessions within the apartment, brief walks to nearby streets, cautious encounters in cafes or bookstores. But the moment I realized we could no longer confine this process to private spaces came unexpectedly, in the form of a phone call. One of his relatives, someone with whom he had always felt a mix of admiration and apprehension, wanted to meet for coffee. He hesitated when he mentioned it to me, voice low, filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Do you think I should tell them?" he asked, twisting the hem of his sleeve nervously. I could see the anxiety ripple across his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw, the hesitation in his movements. The moral responsibility of this new stage hit me with full force. We spoke for hours that evening about whether it was wise to proceed, about the potential consequences, about how to balance authenticity with caution. I tried to help him articulate his feelings without pressuring, to explore the boundaries of honesty and safety without imposing my own judgments. He spoke of wanting to be seen as himself, not a caricature, not a curiosity, but a person worthy of respect. And yet, the fear was real, the fear of misunderstanding, of rejection, of ridicule that might pierce not just him, but the fragile trust between us. I realized then that transformation is never just about clothing, gestures, or internal shifts, it is a negotiation with the world, a careful exercise in moral navigation, in weighing risk against the profound necessity of authenticity. The meeting itself was a delicate dance. I accompanied him, though I tried to remain unobtrusive, a quiet anchor rather than a shield. He moved slowly, deliberately, adjusting his posture, testing expressions in mirrors and windows, measuring reactions even before they occurred. The relative arrived with a warm smile, unaware of the internal struggle unfolding before them. Conversation began cautiously, and I noticed a slight stiffening in him at every glance and word. But gradually, he found footing. The act of being observed, of existing in this self in the presence of someone familiar yet outside our private bubble, was at first destabilizing. And yet, with each small interaction, he grew steadier. A laugh that had once been hesitant became more relaxed. Hands that had fidgeted now rested naturally. Words flowed with a quiet, assured rhythm. It was not dramatic, not performative, it was authentic. I found myself reflecting constantly on my own role, on the ethics of guidance and support. Every suggestion I made, every subtle reassurance, carried weight. Could I push him too far? Could I shield him too much? Could my presence, however gentle, inadvertently influence the authenticity he was striving to inhabit? I realized that empathy is not passive, it is active, deliberative, and morally exacting. I had to hold space for him to navigate fear and courage simultaneously, while constantly calibrating my own impulses. And in doing so, I became acutely aware of how fragile the line is between guidance and control, between support and subtle domination, between being present and imposing. After the meeting, we walked quietly along the riverbank, reflecting on the experience. He spoke softly about the relief he felt, the pride, and the exhaustion that accompanied it. It's strange, he said, to feel like myself and yet be seen differently. I don't know if I can explain it. I nodded, understanding perfectly. Transformation is not a linear trajectory, nor is it always comprehensible in words. It is a mosaic of moments, small victories, and minor crises, each leaving a subtle but indelible imprint on self-perception and moral awareness. I realized that our work together was not merely experimental, it was an ethical undertaking, a shared commitment to navigate vulnerability, courage, and trust. The following week brought new challenges. Friends, unaware of the ongoing process, began to notice subtle changes in demeanor, voice, and movement. Casual remarks, intended lightly, sometimes carried unintended weight. He would flinch at jokes, at playful teasing, at innocent comments that revealed society's unconscious pressure to conform. And I had to navigate my own reactions carefully, when to intervene, when to let him experience and negotiate social dynamics himself, when to speak, when to remain silent. I realized that ethical accompaniment is not about control, it is about discernment, patience, and moral vigilance. Every interaction was a microcosm of the broader journey, a test of trust, of resilience, and of shared responsibility. One evening, he shared something profoundly personal. I've been hiding this part of me for years, he said, eyes fixed on the floor. And now that I'm exploring it, I feel more myself than I ever have. But I'm scared of losing who I was, or of being rejected for who I am becoming. I listened, deeply, letting silence hold the weight of his confession. It was one of the most intimate moments we had shared, revealing the core tension between identity, social expectation, and self-acceptance. And I realized that transformation is inseparable from moral responsibility, to witness, to support, to reflect without co-opting, and to preserve dignity in a world that often misunderstands difference. Over the next several days, we experimented with subtle expressions of self outside our usual spaces, visiting familiar stores, taking walks past acquaintances, engaging in small social encounters with deliberate attentiveness. Each moment was a negotiation, not of appearance alone, but of trust, courage, and integrity. And through it, I observed my own growth, a heightened sense of empathy, an acute awareness of moral responsibility, a recognition of the complexity inherent in guiding someone through self-discovery. I understood that transformation is not a gift one gives another, it is a shared endeavor, requiring patience, vigilance, humility, and ethical discernment. By the end of Part 5, it was clear to me that what we were doing went beyond crossdressing or identity exploration. It was an intricate, living lesson in empathy, trust, and moral engagement. The risks were real, the stakes quietly immense, and yet the rewards, the glimpses of authenticity, the moments of self-recognition, the subtle courage cultivated, were profound. I realized, with quiet awe, that the act of witnessing another person inhabit their true self, while carefully navigating ethical responsibility, can be transformative not only for them but for anyone willing to hold space with honesty, integrity, and compassion. And deep down, I knew that the culmination of this journey, the emotional turning point, the social reckoning, the full embrace of self, was still ahead, waiting for us with all its uncertainty, courage, and potential for revelation. The final weeks of our journey carried a weight I had not anticipated, a quiet gravity that settled over every decision, every gesture, every word exchanged between us. By now, the initial novelty of our sessions had long faded, replaced by something far more intricate, the deliberate, painstaking navigation of identity, trust, and moral responsibility. He had grown in ways subtle but profound, I had grown in ways I had never imagined possible. And yet, as we prepared for the ultimate step, an encounter outside our familiar circles, in spaces that demanded authenticity and courage, I could feel the tension pressing in from all directions, a reminder that transformation is never comfortable, never neat, never guaranteed. We decided on a small gathering, a dinner with family members who had not yet seen him in this emergent form. The decision had been mutual, discussed over countless evenings of reflection, negotiation, and candid admission of fear. He was nervous, naturally, but resolute in his desire to inhabit the self he had been exploring privately for months. As he prepared, adjusting the scarf around his neck, straightening the lines of his jacket, I watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. There was a remarkable stillness in him now, a confidence built not on the superficiality of clothing, but on an inner recognition of who he was allowed to be. I realized that the journey had transformed him in ways neither of us could have predicted. The subtle courage to exist authentically had become the axis around which his self-awareness now turned. The dinner itself was a delicate, almost ceremonial exercise in courage. Each step into the living room, each greeting, each tentative glance exchanged carried layers of significance. I noticed how he measured his gestures, how he allowed himself moments of natural expression while remaining attuned to the social dynamics around him. There were awkward pauses, yes, small missteps, brief flinches, but they were met with grace, humor, and eventually, a growing acceptance from those present. I sat quietly beside him, offering subtle reassurances, conscious of the fact that even a glance or a touch from me could either reinforce his confidence or inadvertently cast a shadow over his autonomy. I had never understood moral vigilance in such a nuanced, intimate form until this evening. Throughout the meal, I observed not only his bravery but also the profound ripple effect it had on me. I had been learning empathy in a theoretical sense for years, but here it was active, alive, and morally exacting. I realized that true empathy requires attentiveness to timing, context, and the psychological state of another person. It demands a constant evaluation of how words, gestures, and presence influence those we care for. I was learning to witness without overshadowing, to support without steering, to guide without controlling, a delicate balance that revealed the depth of responsibility inherent in any human relationship. As the evening progressed, conversations turned naturally toward memories, shared experiences, and everyday life. He participated fully, his voice steady, his laughter light, his posture open. It was not a performance, it was an embodiment of months of reflection, practice, and ethical collaboration. I could see the quiet awe in his family members' expressions, the subtle recognition that he was both the same person they had always known and someone emerging into fuller self-awareness. And in that recognition, I felt a surge of profound understanding that transformation, at its core, is not about spectacle or external validation, but about the integrity of self-expression, the moral courage to claim authenticity in the presence of others, and the quiet dignity of navigating vulnerability with intention. Later, when we returned to our apartment, exhaustion and relief mingled in a strange, comforting alchemy. We sat in silence for a long time, reflecting not just on the evening, but on the journey as a whole. He spoke softly about fear, pride, and the sense of liberation that accompanied being fully recognized by those who mattered. "It's incredible," he said. "To feel like I'm allowed to exist this way, and to have people see it without judgment." I nodded, understanding perfectly. Transformation is often measured not in grand gestures, but in moments of recognition, in the quiet validation of self by oneself and others. And I realized that my role, though subtle, had been integral in holding space for this journey, balancing empathy with vigilance, support with respect, and guidance with humility. In the following days, our reflections deepened. He spoke about how his perception of self had evolved, how the tentative courage of the first session had blossomed into a grounded confidence, and how social interactions now carried a new texture of possibility rather than fear. I, in turn, reflected on the ways I had been changed by witnessing him, by accompanying him, by holding a mirror up to both his courage and my own ethical choices. I realized that empathy is not a passive state, it is an active, moral, and deeply transformative practice. To witness transformation responsibly is to accept the weight of ethical engagement, the responsibility of presence, and the humility required to support another's self-discovery without overshadowing it with one's own assumptions or desires. We began to talk about the future, about sustaining this self-awareness, and about the small daily practices that would continue to reinforce his authenticity. We discussed public spaces, social interactions, and the need to remain attentive to both emotional resilience and moral integrity. The transformation was no longer just an experiment, it had become a lived reality, a daily negotiation of identity, courage, and social navigation. And I knew that, as with all journeys of self-discovery, it would never truly end. There would always be moments of doubt, of challenge, of reflection, but the foundation we had built together, rooted in empathy, trust, and ethical responsibility, would sustain us through whatever lay ahead. As I lay awake that night, I thought about the lessons I had learned, that transformation is less about surface appearances than about the interior landscape of courage and self-recognition, that empathy is an active, morally demanding engagement, that's supporting another person's journey toward. Authenticity requires patience, vigilance, humility, and care. And I thought about him, about the way he had grown, the bravery he had cultivated, the dignity with which he now navigated the world. I felt a quiet pride, not possessive, not celebratory, but reverent for the human capacity for growth, understanding, and moral courage. In the end, I realized that transformation is not a finite event, it is a continuous unfolding of self-awareness, trust, and relational responsibility. Helping him inhabit his authentic self had not only changed him, it had changed me. I had learned the depth of empathy, the subtlety of moral guidance, and the extraordinary impact of bearing witness with integrity. And as the night deepened, I understood something I had not known at the start, that the truest value of transformation lies not in appearance, not in performance, but in the quiet, profound act of allowing another person, and oneself, to be fully seen, fully understood, and fully human. And in that moment, I knew, the journey we had undertaken, with all its vulnerability, moral responsibility, and emotional intensity, had revealed the essence of empathy, courage, and integrity. It had shown me, with quiet, unyielding clarity, that supporting someone's emergence into selfhood is one of the most profound acts of human connection we can undertake, and that in doing so, we are forever changed, more aware, and more capable of compassion.